Hi, I'm Dana. You're watching Life, Love, and Books, and today I'm going to be doing my October/November reading wrap-up. I never got the chance to do one for October. The first book that I read in October was Fire with Fire by Jenny Han and Saban Vivian. This is the sequel to Burn for Burn, and then the last book in the trilogy is called Ashes to Ashes, which I haven't read yet. This is like a hardcore revenge story about these three girls who are trying to get revenge on the people who have wronged them. And it's pretty intense. I really enjoy this series. They're pretty large for contemporaries. And I like the way all three of the lead characters are written. It's written from like all three of their perspectives. And I think it's a really enjoyable read. The next book I have is actually a reread, and it's We Were Liars by E. Lockhart. My book club read this in October. It was our October book. So I reread it so I could discuss it. It was actually really interesting reading this book, like rereading it, because you kind of notice all of the foreshadowing and everything a lot more, and it's a lot creepier rereading it because you know everything. Anyway, I think the first time I read this, I think I gave it 4 out of 5 stars. The next book I have is Freakonomics by Stephen D. Levitt and Stephen J. Dubner. This is a nonfiction story about the hidden side of everything. It's about economics and how it applies to not money situations and incentives and stuff. It's actually really interesting. There's a movie about it. There's a movie of it in case you don't want to read the book. There's like this really giant section that's super boring about sumo wrestling, but everything else in the movie is really interesting. The next book I read is Afterworld by Scott Westerfeld. This book is actually 2 books, so it's a really interesting concept. We have Darcy, who is a young debut YA author in all of the chapters that are white here. And then in the black chapters, we are reading the book that she's written, Afterworlds. So I thought this was really interesting. I liked Lizzie's side of the story a lot more than Darcy's. I felt like Lizzie's kind of gave me the insight into a world that I'll never know, but I've always kind of wanted to know, which was really interesting. But Darcy did have an interesting story. I did feel like, not Darcy, Lizzie had an interesting story, but I felt like there was a disconnect between like me getting connected to Lizzie's character, because I always felt like she was separated from me by Darcy, which I don't know if that really makes sense. So I did give this 4 out of 5 stars because I didn't totally connect to Lizzie. The next book that I have is Midwinter Blood by Marcus Sedgwick. This was the Prince Award winner for this year. I wasn't the biggest fan. I think I gave it 3 out of 5 stars. Like, I liked it, but it was kind of just average to me. I don't know why it won the Prince Award over Eleanor and Park. It kind of does this really weird time travel thing that is supposed to be innovative, but I kind of found it dull and not really interesting. I know there are a lot of people who like this book though, so the next book that I read was actually a book for school, and it was Beowulf by Unknown, because no one knows who wrote it. I read like 2 or 3 different translations because my teacher kind of like handed us packets of it, so I'm not totally sure which translations I read. One was in free verse and one wasn't, like there were no line numbers. It felt like it was prose instead of verse. But it was interesting. I wasn't the biggest fan. I had to read it in like a day. It was a shortened version, but I had to read it in like a day and then do this giant packet on it, which definitely tainted my enjoyment. After that, I read The Infinite Sea by Rick Yancey. This is the sequel to The Fifth Wave, and it's a lot thinner than The Fifth Wave was. Like, The Fifth Wave was pretty massive, and this book's kind of just like, it feels like a baby in comparison. But I did enjoy this book. I didn't like it as much as I liked The Fifth Wave, but there weren't as many like, holy crap moments in this book, in my opinion. But I did think it was a good book, and I think it's a really good setup for whatever's going to happen in book 3. After that, I read a short story, which I put on this list because it took me forever to get through, and it's on Goodreads. And it's Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, which is a story about Sir Gawain from the Knights of the Round Table. And again, giant packet, had to read in like a day, and after that I read Dracula. And even though I had a giant packet and I only had a week to read this, This was actually really good. I think I gave this 5 out of 5 stars because honestly, I don't know why I enjoyed this book so much, but I loved it a lot. We were reading it around Halloween, so this is the first book that I finished in November because it was due on November 4th. I finished it November 2nd. But I had to fill out this huge packet and really analyze this book. But this book reads very modern, which is strange to me for a book that's written in 1898 with kind of like, it's written in letter and format and like there's newspaper clippings and it's really interesting. If you're interested in picking up a classic, I would definitely recommend you pick up Dracula. After I read Dracula, I read Before I Fall, which was my book club's November book of the month. This book is about a girl who gets in a car crash and dies, and then she wakes up the next morning and it's the same day, and she relives the same day 7 times. The next book that I read is The Retribution of Mara Dyer by Michelle Hodkin. This is the final book in the Mara Dyer trilogy. The first book is The Unbecoming of Mara Dyer, and the second is The Evolution of Mara Dyer. This was a good conclusion. I felt like it didn't wrap up as much as I wanted it to, or in the way that I wanted to, and I didn't really enjoy it as the other two. I think I'd give it 3.5 out of 5 stars, but I did enjoy it, and it definitely like was a good conclusion, but like I wanted more Noah in the story, and it didn't wrap up the way I thought it should wrap up. The next book I read after that was Paradise Lost by John Milton. I actually didn't read all of Paradise Lost. I read books 1, 2, and 9 of Paradise Lost, but it took me 4 hours to read those books, so I'm gonna give it to myself because that's basically the amount of time it takes to read an entire book. That book was intense. I'm not sure if I'm gonna finish reading it. Like, I might because it was really interesting, but it was a struggle to get through, man. It's like this intensely dense and filled with biblical allusions, poetry style writing, like crazy. And then I have The Sorcerers Air by Cinda Williams-Chima, which I was reading somewhat alongside Mara Dyer, but it took me longer to get through this one. I got this the week it came out, which I think was in October, and Cinda Williams-Chima came to my school and she signed it, and it says, "To Dana, never stop believing in magic, Cinda Williams-Chima." And God, she's like the nicest person. We talked for like 10 minutes and I was late for class, but it was totally worth it. She's so nice, and yeah, I want to be best friends with her. Basically, that's basically the moral of the story. This is actually the second time I met her. She had come to my school before, but I was like way too nervous to talk to her, so I just like casually like looked at her and I was like anyway, the next book that I read was Blue Lily, Lily Blue by Maggie Stiefvater. This is the 3rd book in the Raven Boys Quartet. This was a really good book, like legitimately enjoyable. I loved the way the plot developed in this book. I loved the way we learned like the mythology developed. If you don't know, the Raven Boys has like this really intense kind of like obscure mythology about this Irish king who died and now he's buried on a magic line, and if you wake him up you get this wish. And it's a lot better than I just made it sound, but it has this really cool mythology, and we explored it in this book, and I think it really kind of developed in this book. I really enjoy this series. I think Maggie Stiefvater, like, everyone is like Shiver, and I don't think like they see her name on other books and they think of Shiver. Like, Shiver is her only, like, Shiver is not comparable to the other books she writes. I don't really understand Shiver, like, in the Maggie Stiefvater world of writing. So, the next book that I read is Sacrifice by Bridget Kimmerer. This is the 5th and final book in the Elemental series by Bridget Kimmerer. It is narrated by Michael, who is the oldest brother and an Earth Elemental. This was not my favorite. It was like above Spirit. Spirit was my least favorite, but I still really enjoyed it. This is like a really good fun series, so if you're interested in that, first book is Storm, and then it's Spark, Spirit, Secret, and then sacrifice. And then the next book that I read was Schizo by Nick Sheff. I read this while I was sick. This book was like kind of crazy. Like, I really like the way it developed because the main character has schizophrenia and we're reading from his point of view. So I was never totally sure what was real and what was not because I was like, what if he's hallucinating? So I thought that was really like kind of an interesting, unreliable narrator kind of thing going on. And there's a crazy twist in this book, which I didn't see coming. But I mean, I don't know, maybe it was obvious to someone who wasn't sick while they were reading it.